Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. We are talking about the females who are totally blocked off, and we're on the fifth type of female, and this is the uterine sister. 6 types of people block her off completely. The father, and secondly the father's father, and going up in that line. We have the son, and also the son's son, and going down in that line. And fifthly, we have the daughter. We mentioned before that the uterine siblings are completely blocked off by any son or daughter. Of course, that includes the son's son and also the son's daughter. So the uterine siblings are fairly easily blocked off. And sixthly, we have the son's daughter. Like we said, the uterine siblings are easily blocked off. The consanguine siblings are not so easily blocked off because the daughter cannot block off the consanguine siblings. Okay. Now let us give a general rule about the usul blocking each other off. Now we have mentioned this, but we'll repeat it here again because this is vital. When it comes to the usul, so we're talking about the parents and grandparents and so on, then the nearer blocks off the further if they are of the same gender. So the mother blocks off the grandmother blocks off the great-grandmother, and so on. But the mother does not block off the grandfather. Why is this? Because they're not of the same gender. And likewise the other way around. The father certainly blocks off the grandfather, but the father cannot block off the grandmother because of the difference in their gender. The next rule we need to know is that every son blocks off anyone beneath him, regardless of gender. So in other words, the son blocks off the grandson and the granddaughter. The grandson, meaning the son's son, will block off the great-grandson and the great-granddaughter. So we see the son is immensely powerful at blocking people off. And the third general rule about blocking people off is that the males from the usul and the furu' block off anyone from the hawashi. So the father, the father's father, or the son, or the son's son. These types of males, however far up or far down you want to go, they block off anyone from the side. So the brothers, the sisters, the uncles, the cousins, the nephews, and so on. And we have the fourth general rule, which is that any male from the hawashi blocks off anyone beneath him. So, for example, the brother blocks off his son because the son is beneath the brother. And the brother, of course, is from the hawashi, so the male from the hawashi blocks off someone who is beneath them. The consanguine brother, for example, will block off the full brother's son because the full brother's son is beneath the consanguine brother, one level below. Whereas the consanguine brother is on the same level as the deceased. And we have given examples of this before. Note also that the full brother blocks off any consanguine sibling, as mentioned before, but the full brother cannot block off the uterine brother. Why is this? Because the uterine brother is a dhu fard. He has a fixed fraction. Now, let us move on to another topic. You may remember that previously we spoke about al-awl. That is when the fractions add up to more than 1. And so we just need to adjust the total parts which we divided the wealth up in. Now opposite to that is when we fall short of 1 whole. Take this example. The deceased leaves behind a mother and a uterine sister. The mother receives a third and the uterine sister, because she is 1, receives a sixth. We take a third and we take a sixth. These are the 2 fractions involved. We ask, what's the common denominator? It is, of course, 6. So we divide the wealth up into 6 parts. The mother receives a third, so a third over 6 is 2, so she receives 2 parts out of the 6 parts. And the uterine sister receives a sixth, so that's 1 part out of 6. So the mother receives 2 parts, the uterine sister receives 1 part. That makes 3 parts. But remember, we divided the wealth up into 6 parts. So that leaves us with an excess of 3 parts. Who does that go to? Some scholars would say, well, it goes to the Baytul Mal, and other scholars would say, no, they're just returned back to the inheritors. And this is the weightier opinion, because Allah Jalla wa Ala says, وَأُولُو الْأَرْحَامِ بَعْضُهُمْ أَوْلَى بِبَعْضٍ. Relatives are more worthy to each other. So it's more worthy to return the wealth back to them than to give it to the Baytul Mal. So in a case like this, because only 3 parts were shared, we will not divide the wealth up into 6 parts. Rather, we will divide the wealth up into 3 parts. The mother receives the 2 parts and the sister receives 1 part. So actually what ends up happening is that the mother in effect does take more than a third. And the sister also here does take more than the sixth. Just like in the awl, each person of the fraction actually ends up taking less than the actual fraction. So to summarize it, increasing the number of shares is called al-awl, and decreasing the number of shares, like we have just done in this particular example, is called ar-rad. Note, however, that ar-rad is not made to the spouse, and the reason why it is not made to the spouse is because the spouse is not a relative, meaning related by blood. Let's take another example. He leaves behind a grandmother, a daughter, and a son's daughter. So here the grandmother receives a sixth, the daughter receives a half, and the son's daughter receives a sixth, making up 2/3. So from the fractions, we take the common denominator, which is of course 6. So we divide the wealth up into 6 parts. The mother receives a sixth, that's 1 part. The daughter receives a half, so that's 3 parts. And the son's daughter receives a sixth, so that is 1 part. 1 plus 3 plus 1 is 5. But we divided the wealth up into 6 parts, which leaves us with a surplus of 1 part. So what do? Simple. Instead of dividing the wealth up into 6 parts, we divide it up into 5 parts. So the grandmother receives 1, the daughter receives 3 parts, and the son's daughter receives 1 part. So in effect, each person ends up taking more than what they would normally take, and this is the result of ar-rad. These fractions given in the Quran were never intended to add up to 1, which is what you're used to in your mathematics classes, where the fractions would add up to 1. Let's give another example. The deceased leaves behind 2 grandmothers and a consanguine sister. So the 2 grandmothers will share equally in a sixth, and the consanguine sister receives a half. So the common denominator here is 6, so we'll divide the wealth up into 6 parts. The 2 grandmothers receive 1 part, and the consanguine sister receives 3 parts, because that is a half of 6. But the total number of parts given would be then 4, 1 plus 3. But we divided the wealth into 6 parts, so that leaves a surplus of 2 parts. So what do? We make ar-rad, which means instead of dividing the wealth into 6 parts, we simply divide it into 4 parts. 1 part to the grandmothers and 3 parts to the consanguine sister. Another example. She leaves behind a husband and 2 daughters. The husband receives a quarter, and the 2 daughters receive 2/3. Now normally, we would ask ourselves what the common denominator is out of a quarter and 2/3. Of course, we know that is 12. However, if we just hold back and take a look, the 2/3 and a quarter does not make up 1 whole. We fall short of 1 whole, which means this is going to be a case of rad. So now, instead of dividing the wealth up into 12 parts, which would normally be the case, we understand that this is a case of rad, and also the husband will not receive the rad. It will be for the daughters alone. So in a case like this, the easiest thing to do is to look at the fraction for the spouse, which in this case is a quarter, and simply divide the wealth up into 4 parts, which is the denominator of the husband's share. So we'll divide the wealth up into 4 parts now. The husband receives a quarter, that's 1 part, and all the rest, which are 3 parts in this case, will go to the 2 daughters, who will share equally in them. This is the easiest course of action. Now, we could have divided the wealth up into 12 parts, and ultimately we end up with the same thing, but the easiest course of action would be to do as we have stated. And this is the case where you have a spouse and another inheritor who also receives a fixed share. Let's take another example, a similar one. He leaves behind a wife and a daughter. So the fractions are the wife receives an eighth and the daughter receives a half. Now again, normally we would take the common denominator, which in this case would be between the eighth and a half, which is 8. But we realize that an eighth plus a half does not reach 1, so we're going to have a situation of a rad. So again, we take a look at the share of the spouse, which is an eighth, and the denominator there is 8. So we're going to divide the wealth up into 8 parts, which happens to be the same as the common denominator of an eighth and a half in this case. So nothing changes essentially. So we'll divide the wealth up into 8 parts. The wife receives 1 part, and all the rest goes to the daughter, that is 7 parts. So of course the daughter ends up receiving more than a half, but this is due to the rad. Another example, the deceased leaves behind a grandmother and 2 uterine sisters. So the fractions are that the grandmother receives a sixth and the two uterine sisters share in a third. So again, we see that if we add a third and a sixth, this does not add up to 1. It falls short. So again, this is going to be a situation of a rad. We look at the common denominator. In this case, it is 6. Divide the wealth up into 6 parts. The grandmother receives 1 part and the sisters receive 2 parts. But of course, this makes 3 parts in total. So what we simply do is that instead of dividing the wealth into 6 parts, we divide it up into 3 parts. The grandmother receives 1 and the 2 sisters receive 2. Okay, what about this? He leaves behind a wife, a grandmother, and 2 uterine sisters. First of all, the fractions, the wife receives a quarter, the grandmother receives a sixth, and the uterine sisters receive a third, in which they're going to share equally. Looking at the common denominators, we would come up with the number 12. However, before proceeding any further, we realize that a quarter plus a sixth plus a third does not add up to 1. It falls short, meaning it is less than 1. So that in turn means this is a mas'alatur rad. So we will not divide the wealth up into 12 parts. We know that the rad does not happen to the wife. So we're going to divide the wealth up into the denominator of the wife's fraction, which is 4. So we'll divide the wealth up into 4 parts. The wife receives a quarter, that's 1 part, and all the rest of the parts, which are 3, will be shared amongst the grandmother and the uterine sisters. So that is to say, these 3 parts which are left over, the grandmother will take a sixth of these 3 parts, and the 2 uterine sisters will take a third of these 3 parts. So that is to say, with these 3 parts, we see that the grandmother receives a sixth, and the uterine sisters receive a third. So the common denominator between a sixth and a third is 6. Dividing this wealth up into 6 parts, the grandmother receives 1 part, and the sisters receive 2 parts. But of course that makes 3 parts. So instead of dividing the wealth up into 6 parts, we'll divide it up into 3 parts, grandmother receiving 1 part, and the sisters sharing equally in the 2 parts. So to summarize, you just give the spouse his or her share and be off with them. Then the rest which remains is divided as per usual amongst the other inheritors who receive their fixed fractions. And this will be a mas'ala of ar-rad. Let's take another example. He leaves behind a mother and 2 uterine brothers. Here the mother receives a sixth and the brothers share in a third. The common denominator we find is 6, so divide the wealth into 6 parts. The mother receives 1 part and the brothers, a third of a 6, receive 2 parts. 1 plus 2 is 3, which leaves a surplus of 3 parts. So this is a case of rad. So we just divide the wealth up into 3 parts. The mother receives 1 and the brothers share equally in 2. Another example, he leaves behind a wife, a mother, and 2 uterine brothers. So this example is the same as the previous one, only now we've added a wife. Let's see how this plays out. The wife receives a quarter, the mother a sixth, and the 2 uterine brothers share in a third. Now normally the common denominator would have been 12, because we have 4, 6 and 3. But here we realize, because we have a spouse involved, that a quarter plus a sixth plus a third falls short from 1 whole, which means we're going to have the mas'alatur rad. So we will not divide it up into 12 parts, we'll divide it up into 4 parts because that is the denominator of the spouse. So 4 parts then, the spouse, who is the wife in this case, receives 1 part, and we're done with her. The rest of the parts, which are 3 in total, will be shared amongst the mother and the 2 uterine brothers. So we'll take this part, which are 3 shares of course. The mother receives a sixth and the brothers receive a third. The common denominator is 6. So dividing the wealth up into 6 parts, the mother receives 1 part and the brothers receive 2 parts. That makes 3 parts in total, which gives a surplus of 3 parts because initially we divided it into 6 parts. So using the situation of rad, we simply divide it into 3 parts and the mother receives 1 part, the brothers receiving 2 parts. Another example. The deceased leaves behind a mother, a daughter, and a son's daughter. First of all, the fractions, the mother a sixth, the daughter a half, and the son's daughter a sixth, making up 2/3. There is no spouse here, so we can proceed with the common denominator. From 6, 2, and 6, the common denominator is 6. divide the wealth into 6 parts. The mother receives 1 part, daughter 3 parts, and the son's daughter 1 part. That makes a grand total of 5 parts, leaving us a surplus of 1 part. So we simply divide the wealth up into 5 parts. The mother receives 1 part, daughters 3 parts, and the son's daughter 1 part. Now we'll take the same example and we'll add in a wife. So we have a wife, a mother, a daughter, and a son's daughter. Firstly, the fractions. The wife receives an eighth, the mother a sixth, the daughter a half, and the son's daughter a sixth, making up 2/3. In this situation we have a spouse, so we have to be a bit more careful. We see that the fractions add up to less than a half. So the common denominator would have been 24. But because we realize that this is the mas'alatul rad, we will divide the wealth up into the denominator of the wife, which is 8. So 8 parts it is. The wife receives an eighth, which is 1 part, and we're done with her. That leaves us with 7 parts to be divided between the mother, daughter, and son's daughter. So we begin anew, and the mother receives a sixth, the daughter a half, and the son's daughter a sixth, making up 2/3. The common denominator here is 6. So dividing the wealth up into 6 parts, the mother receives 1 part, the daughter 3 parts, and the son's daughter 1 part. 1 plus 3 plus 1 is 5. So we have a surplus of 1 part. So instead of dividing the wealth into 6 parts, we'll divide it up into 5 parts. Now just notice here, when we say that we divide the wealth up into 5 parts, what wealth are we dividing up into 5 parts? The original 7 parts that were left after the wife took her share. So those 7 parts are now divided up into 5 parts. So in other words, the 7 parts are divided into 5 parts. That is 7/5. Now the scholars of inheritance do not like fractions like these, 7/5, because it does not divide equally. They like whole numbers. So what do they do about something like this? And this is not to say that fractional values are wrong. No, mathematically they're sound, but it's just that the fardiyun do not like such numbers. They want to deal with whole numbers. Let's take a look at what they would do. 7/5 does not divide properly. How do you make 7/5 into a whole number? Well, the answer is you just multiply by 5. 7/5 times 5 equals to 7, which is a whole number. You simply times by the denominator. The problem is, however, you cannot just times 7/5 by 5 in isolation, because you rupture the balance. If you're going to multiply anything by 5, you're going to have to multiply everything by 5 in order to maintain the equation and the balance. That is just simple mathematics. So having known this, if we multiply the 7 parts by 5, which gives us 35 parts, we're going to have to multiply the 1 part which the wife took by 5 as well. Or to put it simply, initially we divided the wealth up into 8 parts. If we just multiply that 8 by 5, we get 40 parts. And this would mean we do not have any remainders. So instead of dividing the initial wealth into 8 parts, we'll divide it into 40 parts, because everything must be multiplied by 5. So the wife, instead of receiving 1 part, will receive 5 parts. As for the mother, you'll remember we divided the remainder into 5 parts and the mother received 1 part. So in other words, the mother is receiving 1 part out of 5, in other words, a fifth. So the rest of the parts, which are now going to be 35 parts, will multiply it by a fifth, which gives us 7. The mother receives 7 parts. You'll also remember that the daughter received 3 parts out of 5. That's 3/5. So 35 times 3/5 gives us 21. The daughter receives 21 parts. The son's daughter, you'll remember, was receiving 1 part out of 5, so that is a fifth. Multiply 35 by a fifth, that gives us 7. So the son's daughter receives 7 parts. So if you add these parts up, they total to 40. And the reason why we had to move from 8 parts initially to 40 parts is because of this situation which we found ourselves in which the remainder, which was 7 parts, was being divided by 5, and 7/5 does not fit equally. One might ask at this stage, this all seems a bit complicated. Is it really necessary to upscale from 8 parts to 40 parts? The answer is no, it is not absolutely necessary, but the only reason we do so is to work with whole numbers, as that is what the fardiyun prefer. Okay, let us take another example. He leaves behind a mother and a son's daughter. The mother receives a sixth, the son's daughter receives a half. A common denominator is 6. Divide the wealth into 6 parts. The mother receives 1 part and the son's daughter receives 3 parts. So that makes a total of 4 parts, which leaves us with a surplus of 2 parts. So simply we'll divide the wealth up into 4 parts, and so this becomes the mas'ala of ar-rad. Now let us take the same scenario but add a wife. So we have then a wife, a mother and a son's daughter. The wife receives an eighth, the mother receives a sixth, and the son's daughter receives a half. The common denominator here is 24. However, before dividing it up into 24 parts, we realize, because there is a wife, that if you add the fractions up, an eighth plus a sixth plus a half, it comes to less than 1. So this will be a situation of a rad. Therefore, do not divide the wealth up into the common denominator, which is 24. Rather, divide it up into the wife's denominator, which is 8. So we divide it up into 8 parts. The wife receives 1 part, that's an eighth. And the rest of the 7 parts are divided up amongst the mother and the son's daughter. It will be a case of rad, of course. So these 7 parts will divide it up. The fractions are, the mother receives a sixth and the daughter of the son receives a half. The common denominator here is 6, so divide the wealth up into 6 parts. The mother receives 1 part and the daughter receives 3 parts, because that's a half, so that makes 4 parts in total. So instead of dividing into 6 parts, we'll divide it into 4 parts. The mother 1 and the son's daughter 3. So note here what's going on. The 7 parts which were left over after the wife took her share are now being divided up into 4 parts. 7 over 4 is not an exact value. So the fardiyun would say, no, we want whole numbers. So how do you make 7 over 4 into a whole number? You simply multiply it by 4. 7 over 4 times 4 equals to 7. But if we're going to multiply these 7 parts by 4, we're going to have to multiply everything by 4 in order to maintain the balance. So if we go back to the beginning, remember at the beginning we divided up into 8 parts, so we're now going to divide it up into 8 times 4, which is 32 parts. The wife will take her eighth, so an eighth of 32 is 4. She takes 4 parts. That leaves us with 28 parts. Now you'll remember that the remainder was divided up into 4 parts, so this 28 parts will be divided up into 4 parts. You'll remember also the mother took 1 part out of 4. So she's going to take a quarter of this 28, so that makes 7 parts for her. You'll also remember that the son's daughter took 3 parts out of 4, that's 3 quarters, so she's going to take 3 quarters of this 28 parts, so that makes 21 parts. So in summary, the wife takes 4 parts, the mother takes 7 parts, and the son's daughter takes 21 parts. And all the parts total to 32. And with this then, we will end our presentation on inheritance. And let us end the track with a few review questions. Question number 1. Recall the 4 main general rules with regards to people blocking each other off completely. Question number 2. A person dies and leaves behind a mother and 2 uterine sisters. Give how the inheritance is going to be divided. Question number 3. Take the same scenario from question number 2 and just add in a wife. Now solve this situation using whole numbers.